everybody, thanks for joining me again as we dive into the Word of God. Today we're looking at the book of Ruth. This is just 4 chapters. It is such a precious story. So many people love it. Won't take you very long to read. And this story of Ruth is like a diamond in the rough because the story actually takes place in the time of the Judges according to the first verse. Which means that if you read Judges and if you listened to my video previously on Judges, you know that the book of Judges is just disturbing. People were doing what was right in their own eyes. The sin became very, very rampant. And yet in the midst of all that, the book of Ruth is a beautiful picture of a people who actually obeyed God. Boaz was a man of God, walked in integrity. He loved God and he actually obeyed the commandments in the Torah. And so it's a beautiful picture of redemptive love and such. In fact, the theme of this book, we often will say, is a kinsman redeemer. Many people read this book because this is a kind of a beautiful love story. It's different than our love stories because the culture was different. But the reason why it makes it so beautiful is because it was redemptive. Now, the book of Ruth was actually written to establish the lineage or the family history of King David. So just like Judges kind of sets us up for why we need a leader like David, Ruth actually establishes David's actual lineage. Boaz was actually David's great-grandfather. And it's interesting because not only does this establish David's lineage, but this book fits into the lineage of Jesus, who is a descendant of David. And it's really neat because in Matthew chapter 1, Matthew starts off his gospel laying out a genealogy of David genealogy of Jesus. And in it, he walks through this lineage of Jesus and talks about Ruth, who is a Gentile. And she's not the only Gentile in the lineage of Jesus. And so it's amazing because these stories of these women of God who actually become part of the story of bringing redemption to the world through Jesus Christ. And so the book fits into a powerful history of redemption, but the book itself is about redeeming love. The theme is kinsman redeemer, which I'll explain in a second, but it's a powerful picture. Many people love it as a love story. Though it's different than our culture, it is a powerful love story of redeeming love. Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Well, let me give just a brief overview of this 4-chapter story. It's really a story in like a 4-act play, and in it I'll explain the theme being kinsman redeemer. Well, the story opens up in chapter 1 in the time of the Judges, in the time of a famine. And this family, Naomi being the wife with her husband, her 2 sons, they go off to Moab to try to survive this famine or recession. And in that time, her husband and her 2 sons die. It's super tragic. It's so sad. And yet in that, these 2 sons had married 2 women who were not Jewish. They were Gentiles. Well, Naomi decides to go back to her hometown, Bethlehem in Israel. And when she's going back, she tells the 2 ladies, hey, you guys go back to your families. I don't have any sons. I can't take care of you. I'm a widow. And one of the ladies, Orpah, she says, okay, sounds good. And she leaves. But it's Ruth, a Gentile woman, who covenants her heart to Naomi. She says, no, I'm not leaving you. She's saying, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And she really makes and confirms a covenant with Naomi. And in that really is adopted into the family of Israel. It's this beautiful picture. It's one of my favorite verses. I often say it to God, that I am following Jesus and his God is my God and his people my people. And I'll go where he goes. I'll stay where he stays. I love that verse. Well, then they get back to Bethlehem in chapter 2 and they have nothing. They have no land. They have no food. They are widows. And so in chapter 2, Naomi sends Ruth to the fields to glean, and she ends up in the field of this man named Boaz. And here's the thing, that this is actually an Old Testament commandment to allow orphans and widows, people who are poor, to kind of like glean or pick the leftovers from the fields during harvest. And Boaz lets her, and Boaz protects her. And again, this is a picture of a man who fears God, is doing the right thing, and is very protective, honestly, of this woman, Ruth. Well, then Naomi and Ruth, they basically devise a plan here. So Noemi realizes that Boaz is a close relative to her family. And this is what a kinsman redeemer is. She realizes that this man, as a relative, can redeem her and Ruth and redeem even their inheritance. A kinsman redeemer basically was if one of your family members died or was unable to take care of the family, they were obligated to buy the land and take care of the land and raise up children through the widow. And you see this kind of happen in different stories throughout the Old Testament. And the idea was not that they took over, but rather that they protected the land and they raised up an heir. And then once the heir was old enough, then the heir would get the land and the inheritance. And this was a way to preserve the inheritance and preserve the name of the family so that families wouldn't just disappear and dwindle and such. And so in this way, Noemi realizes that Boaz is a close relative, not the closest one, but that he could be a kinsman redeemer, meaning that he could marry Ruth, they could have children, and he could redeem the family as well as the actual physical land and inheritance. So Noemi devises a plan, dresses Ruth up and such, sends Ruth to the threshing floor at night, waits till Boaz falls asleep, and she sneaks in and she uncovers his feet, basically, because of the cool of the night would wake him up. And when he wakes up, he's like, hey, what's going on? Who is this? And Ruth says to him, take me under your covering, which is a metaphoric way of saying, marry me, redeem me, cover me, protect me. And Boaz, again, man of integrity, says, okay, listen, here's some food. You go back to your house and I will take care of it. In other words, he's going to go to the elders and he's going to negotiate for this to happen. And it's just again, a beautiful picture of him redeeming her. And I think there is some genuine love here. It just looks different in their culture. So the chapter 4, Boaz goes to the elders in this gate. This is kind of like a communal public forum of the leaders of the town. And he says, hey, we got Ruth here and Noemi, and someone needs to redeem their land. And he actually speaks to the man who's the closest relative and says, hey, you want to redeem the land? And the guy's like, sure. He says, well, you also have to marry Ruth. And he says, I can't do that. So he backs out, which then gives Boaz the opportunity to do it. And so he redeems the land, he marries Ruth, and he raises up children. And the book ends with describing the lineage of David. He basically says, the last verse says that Obed, which was the son of Boaz and Ruth, Obed begot Jesse, which is the father of David, and Jesse begot David. And you see here how this book, just a beautiful picture of God's redeeming love, ties into the lineage of David and the lineage of Jesus. Now, what's also interesting about this book is it itself becomes a prophetic picture of how Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. Now, this is very common. We call it typology. See, typology is when something that is real in the Old Testament, a real story, a real person, a historical story or figure, becomes a foreshadow pointing to Jesus, who becomes the fulfillment of that. It kind of has two layers. It has, on one hand, a historical, actual, story with its own interpretation, its own application, and yet it also becomes this symbolic picture or a shadow, a foreshadow, pointing to Jesus. Now, this shouldn't surprise us because the whole Bible is his plan of redemption, his story. And he himself is the greatest storyteller. And so, of course, he can work through Abraham and work through Boaz, and his story is their story. But then he can use these things to point to Jesus. This happens all over the Old Testament. In fact, the whole Old Testament, we say, is the New Testament concealed, and the whole New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. Paul talks about this all the time. He says that in Galatians chapter 4, he says Hagar and Sarah were symbolic types of the gospel. Well, we all know Abraham, Hagar, Sarah, these are real people. They had to walk out their own faith really. And their story, their real story, becomes examples of faith to us. But the Apostle Paul says, but these things are also pictures pointing to Jesus. Hagar was a picture of trying to get the promise by the flesh, and Sarah was a picture of receiving the promise by grace through faith. And so just in the same way, the book of Ruth was real story, real people, but also becomes this beautiful picture that Jesus is the kinsman redeemer for us, that in our brokenness, When we as Gentiles, for those of us who had no inheritance, we were outside of Christ. When we put our trust in Jesus, he becomes our covering, our bridegroom, our kinsman redeemer. Ephesians actually says this, that we've been included in Christ. We come into the family of God. We receive the inheritance of the promise. And Ephesians 5 says that he is our head, our covering, our bridegroom. We've got to look at this book as a testimony of a man of God and a woman of God, Boaz and Ruth and even Noemi. And this can be an example of us following the Lord and even obeying God, walking in integrity in the midst of a perverse generation like the book of Judges. And it can also be a powerful picture of how God, through Jesus, heals and restores and redeems us. So I hope you enjoy it. Quick book, dive into it, ask the Lord to show you these things, and I pray you get great insight from the Lord.